Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, should the child support system be abolished? So specifically here I'm talking about mandatory child support based on the income of the two parents. This is an issue that I've heard quite a few times in my clinical experience. People on both sides, those receiving support and those having to pay support, who are upset by the system. Another related question here would be, is the system fair to fathers? So that's kind of where I'm looking at this for this particular video. I'm not focusing as much here on how the system could be unfair to mothers, really focusing more on the fathers. Some other related questions would be, how does mental health factor into the child support debate? And is the child support system good for children? Now, when I use this term child support system, I'm referring to a general set of principles that may vary from country to country or from state to state in the United States. Much of the research I read on this subject deals with the system in the United States, and of course in terms of my clinical experience, I practice in the United States. Now, the goal of child support policy is to reduce child poverty and its adverse effects, but fewer than half of the children who are eligible for child support receive full payment, and many receive no payment. 24% of children under the age of 18 are living with their mothers, but not their fathers. So this whole issue of child support is a significant concern. In my clinical experience, I've seen a lot of people upset with the child support system. Very few people happy with it on either side. It's not unusual for mothers to complain that they don't get enough child support or that the father doesn't pay. Many fathers complain that they're paying too much. The system is too aggressive in chasing them down for money, like putting them in jail or taking away their driver's license. And they believe the system is not willing to make modifications to the support order in response to changing circumstances like the loss of a job. So pretty much it seems like everyone hates the system. So why do we have it? Well, as I talked about before, it's really an anti-poverty measure. But also, if the system were dismantled, taxpayers would end up supporting children, which doesn't seem fair. So many people hate the system, but most people agree that children need to be supported. They need to have their basic needs met. But not everyone agrees that the current system is really the best way to accomplish that. So what are some of the challenges with the current system? Well, the system seems to work against its own goals much of the time. For instance, it's fixated on financial compensation, right? It's really kind of very focused on that without considering a lot of other factors. We know that frequent visits by non-custodial fathers reduce the likelihood that the custodial mother's household will experience what's referred to as food insecurity, so the mother and the children not having enough food. Yet the system is numbers driven, with many fathers reporting they need to be working instead of visiting their children so they can keep up with the support. This financially based system doesn't encourage shared parenting, but shared parenting is remarkably successful. And the research literature is really clear on this. Both the father and the mother being active in a child's life predicts success across many dimensions, including school, staying out of trouble with law enforcement, mental health, and physical health. However, the system doesn't account well for time invested by the father, even when it constitutes childcare, like when the father watches the child so that the mother can go to work. One instance that stands out for me on this topic is this father who cared for his child about 180 days out of the year, so about half the year, but still had to pay over $1,000 a month in child support. If he didn't keep the child at all, the payment would have been $1,050, a $50 difference. So not much of an incentive for that father to get involved with shared parenting. Now, as it turns out in the situation I'm talking about, he did that anyway. He did watch the child for about half the year. But again, there wasn't much of an incentive. It's not a good system. It's not rewarding the behavior that would help the child. His time, the use of his home, and other expenses that would be incurred by this arrangement, like transportation, are essentially discarded by the system. They don't seem to factor into the equation. Now, speaking of equations, we also see a lot of bad math on the part of the courts, but also some of the scientific literature. This problem is called Innumeracy. It's really the mathematical version of illiteracy, and it's an epidemic. I've seen several examples of this. We see in the scientific literature that some research has overestimated the ability of non-custodial fathers, sometimes called non-resident fathers, to pay child support, essentially indicating that a large proportion of these fathers could pay when they actually couldn't pay. And this research was later used to make important policy decisions. Then we see all these formulas that are used in various jurisdictions to determine the amount of child support due. They're based on the income of both parents and not on the actual needs of the child. Lawmakers, court employees, even judges are bad at math, and the formulas make little sense. There is no logical reason behind the dynamics of how they function. I've regularly seen situations where the fathers were paying 50, 60, or 70% of their income in child support. I've seen a few situations where fathers were literally homeless because the payments were too high and they either had to pay the support or rent an apartment, but they couldn't do both. I've seen people who are over $100,000 in arrears with functionally no chance of ever catching up with their support obligation. Now, what exacerbates this problem is the fact that there's typically no accountability for the money. It's often used to support the children, but there are some custodial mothers who use the funds for other purposes and never have to answer to the law. In most jurisdictions, there's absolutely no obligation to track the expenses, zero accountability. So the government is compelling one person to pay another for a specific purpose, helping a child, and then not tracking where that money goes. So what about the mental health aspects? Where does the system fall short in terms of considering mental health concerns? Well, we see that recently divorced fathers with joint physical custody have a higher level of emotional well-being than divorced fathers with non-custodial status. And again, the evidence here is remarkably clear. But immediately after a divorce, the court often grants temporary custody to the mother, and this sets the tone for later proceedings, discouraging fathers from pursuing custody. So they feel like they've lost the battle before the battle has even started. The court bases these decisions on the idea that the mother is automatically going to be a better parent, that the mother should be custodial, when there's actually little evidence to support this. Our best evidence indicates that mothers and fathers form similarly strong bonds with children and are equally effective caregivers. The mental health aspects of divorce and loss are not taken into account when it comes to fathers, with the default arrangement again being that the mothers keep the children. Fathers feel a tremendous sense of loss, which is exacerbated by only seeing the children occasionally through the archaic visitation guidelines. A common schedule, visitation schedule, is one weekend and one weeknight every 2 weeks. So during a divorce, the father is separated from the mother, which most of the time would be somewhat painful, and then loses contact with the children at the same time. The contact he does have is tense and highly scrutinized. The system is not designed to provide mental health counseling or other support to non-custodial fathers. The courts don't seem to understand mental health or personality characteristics and how they factor into behavior during divorces. They may use a mental health diagnosis against a parent, but they fail to appreciate how personality characteristics can be detrimental to the welfare of children. For example, they rarely factor in the destructive effects of narcissism, whether it's narcissism on the part of the father or the mother. For example, one of the characteristics of narcissism we see is manipulation. 20% of custodial mothers who do not receive child support don't receive it because they didn't file for support, specifically because they didn't want the child to have contact with the father. So in these instances, the mothers are churning down money that would be helpful to the children in order to be manipulative. Now, there could be other reasons. They could be scared of the father, and there's other factors. But still, in the instances where it is manipulation, judges aren't catching this. They're not really exploring this angle. They're not ordering evaluations to find this out. Now, an important note when I'm talking about custody. Men are less likely to seek custody, so the gender difference here in custody isn't always about an unfair system, right? So that's important to keep in mind. So moving on with the shortcomings of the system, we come to the idea of the deadbeat dad, right? We hear this all the time. This phrase has been with us for many years. It's a situation where non-custodial fathers who get behind on child support are stigmatized. A deadbeat dad is a father who is behind on child support or who never paid it and who has the resources to pay it. So if a father cannot pay it, they're not a deadbeat dad. Now, of course, there's always going to be certain individuals who don't pay their child support when they are capable of doing so. And this includes fathers and mothers. But is this phenomenon of the deadbeat dad really common enough to live up to the construct the way we see it presented in the media, for example? Well, we see that 66% of fathers who don't pay child support can't pay it. So 2/3 would not qualify under the definition of a deadbeat dad. I believe the stigma of the deadbeat dad really does have a tremendous effect. We see that courts are not responsive enough in hearing modification requests. They're overly punitive when fathers get behind, assuming that they have the resources to pay, but they simply don't want to pay. Not assuming that they may not understand the system, that the fathers may not be able to afford an attorney, or they've had other problems that explain why they didn't pay, like mental health concerns or physical health concerns. The courts tend to jump directly to this idea that the father must be a deadbeat dad, when it's not likely to be the correct explanation. One of the most punitive methods of forcing payment, of course, is incarceration, which should only be used in situations where the fathers demonstrate that they have the means to pay, but are simply unwilling to do so. Interestingly, though, research shows that this strategy of incarceration does not increase the total amount of support money collected. It's not actually an effective means of motivation. The threat of incarceration actually increases feelings of anxiety and depression, which can prevent a father from working. Therefore, they're not earning money. Therefore, they're not paying the child support. Incarceration actually causes a cycle that's bad for children. We see this father who is behind on support, who goes to prison. When they're there, they can't pay the support. Interest accumulates and the payments accumulate. They get more behind. When they're released, they're more likely to be arrested again for the same thing. They're sentenced to more time. They have a criminal record, so getting a job is difficult when they are released. It's just a vicious cycle that has many different components to it. During any given day in the United States, an estimated 50,000 parents are in prison or jail for child support non-payment. The vast majority, of course, are fathers. Now, an interesting note here when talking about the term deadbeat dad, there are more fathers paying child support than mothers, but a greater proportion of non-custodial mothers fail to pay child support. So there's actually a higher proportion of deadbeat moms. There are more deadbeat dads literally, right, in total numbers, but a higher proportion of deadbeat moms, but we rarely hear this term being used. Another reason that fathers get behind on child support is because of the idea of back child support. This is what happens when a father doesn't know that he had a child. So he didn't save money. He didn't set money aside for a child because he didn't know that he had one. So he starts off in arrears. So when that first order is handed down, there's already a liability. I've seen orders of support come through where the father was $10,000 in arrears before he had a chance to make one payment. Then we see this idea of the equitable father, right? This is a controversial issue, and this is where a lot of people are really upset. Even if they agree with some of the other components of the child support system, this part really attracts a lot of attention. And this really has to do with biological fathers versus legal fathers, right? So fathers pay child support for children who aren't theirs. This happens every day. A lot of people believe that if a man can prove that he's not the father of a child, that he'll go into the court and the judge will say, oh, we're really terribly sorry about that. We're going to start collecting this money for you and get that money back to you. We're going to pay it back to you with interest and issue an apology. And the mother, who may have fraudulently led the man to believe he was the father, she'll be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, right? This is not what happens at all, right? What happens in real life is the judge says, you just continue to pay the support. It doesn't matter that you're not the biological father. You're now deemed to be the legal father. In a marriage, the husband is presumed to be the father of a child after his marriage to the mother. In some states, there is an irrefutable presumption of paternity, which means that if a child is born during the marriage, the man will be deemed the father, even if a DNA test says otherwise. Now, I understand that there are a variety of reasons for this policy. It's not simply to be unfair to fathers. It's thought of as more stabilizing for the children. But if a man is not the father of a child, making him legally obligated to support that child based on a behavior in which he did not engage is not reasonable. Not only have I seen this many times in my clinical experience, a man paying child support for a child that wasn't his, I've also seen men go to prison for failing to pay child support for children that weren't theirs. it's not clear what good this accomplishes. So with all this evidence in mind about the child support system, what are my thoughts on mandatory child support based on income? So these are just my opinions based on the literature I've read and, again, my clinical experience. Well, it's clear that some sort of system that involves money changing hands in the situation of the separation of parents is necessary. But I think there are many ways that the current system can be improved. From the very beginning, paternity should be established using scientific methods. DNA testing has been available for some time. Either a man is the father of a child or he's not. If he's not, he shouldn't have to pay child support. I don't really think the arguments about the family stability can outweigh this kind of fundamental right. The presumed custody arrangement when people are divorced should be joint physical custody, and I know that's already the case in some places. One party shouldn't have an advantage going into the custody dispute over another. The courts should strongly encourage and offer resources to facilitate parents working out informal support methods, including what is referred to as in-kind support, like providing childcare, as opposed to structured support payments. The government getting involved in forcing people to pay each other money really should be a last resort. All money paid in accordance with the support order should be accounted for, including money that's paid but goes to the government and never makes it to the custodial mother. So really, accountability helps the mother, the father, and the children. Formulas should be developed for deciding how much support is due based on the actual cost of supporting the child, not necessarily the income of the parents. Non-custodial parents are penalized for earning more, and therefore they may not seek out better income opportunities. Now, this is going to take some math skills. It's difficult to work out the exact cost of raising a child and how much should be credited for being the custodial parent and other factors. But just dodging the issue with lazy formulas is not the answer. Now, in terms of modifications of support orders, this process needs to be faster. If a father loses his job or something else changes, you can't have these payments just accruing and going into the arrears. If he lost his job, he lost his job. It's really just common sense. Additionally, other considerations like the father's mental health and any changes in that mental health status should be weighed. And my last thought in terms of how the child support system maybe should be changed, instead of jumping right to incarceration, how about other programs where individuals work off the debt? We see this with other types of fees, like the fees generated from traffic violations. So it makes sense that it could be applied to child support. And I know in some areas, of course, it is, but I think this is a program that could be expanded. Sending a father to prison for not paying child support, again, is not actually helping the child. So I know whenever I talk about issues like mental health and child support, there are going to be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comments section. They're sure to generate really interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found this description of the shortcomings of the child support system to be interesting. Thanks for watching.